Now it's 9:05 and time for the Moral Maze with Michael Buerk.
Good morning. Two changes today. We're not in our cosy studio in London. We're up in the lovely northeastern city of Durham as part of a BBC outreach programme to get closer to our listeners. To that end, we've an invited audience of the great, the good and the mockingly curious. North and south, east or west, the big event of the week touching everyone's life was the budget. The small-scale selfishnesses of individual profit and loss have been picked clean by other programmes. We're concerned with the moral question that lies behind much public taxation and expenditure. What do we do about the poor? Mr. Brown's rhetorical ambition for his modern welfare state was to stop trapping people in poverty and provide opportunity for all. Well, that begs several questions. First, what is poverty? I spent the 80s working amongst people for whom poverty meant no clothes, shelter, clean water, or even food, and saw thousands starve to death. Europe now defines the impoverished as those living on half the average income, around £180 a week, a quarter of the population. It's a relative definition, of course. The richer the rest of us get, the better off you can be and still be labelled as poor, still be receiving state benefits like income support for so-called basic necessities. Second question, what should they be? Food, water, shelter, obviously, but TV, car, computer? Third question, how far should we try to distinguish between types of poverty, between, as our grandfathers would have put it, the deserving poor and the feckless? Should we define some, those poor through unavoidable circumstance, worthy of our support, others as merely exploiting the benefit culture and our sympathy, who don't deserve it, and treat them accordingly? Last question, what should be the overarching purpose? What sort of society should the state be aiming for? The great political argument of certainly the last half of the century has been over the redistribution of wealth. Not just should the rich be made to pay for the poor, but should it be public policy to make the rich less rich, as well as the poor less poor? How far should we try to dictate equality of outcome, as well as equality of opportunity? What do we do about the poor? Our Budget Week Moral Maze. Live with our usual cast of characters, Janet Daley of The Telegraph, Dr. David Starkey, the constitutional historian, Dr. David Cook, the medical ethicist, and Michael Mansfield QC. David Cook.
Well, there's a realism about Jesus' injunction that the poor will have with us always. It doesn't actually matter whether we're talking about absolute poverty, a lack of food or clothing or shelter, or relative poverty, what's necessary for a normal life in a particular society. Poverty is always evil, and we have a responsibility to do something about it. Not everybody is going to be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, so we have to create structures which will help and not hinder. We mustn't just deal with the symptoms of poverty, we need to change the causes and the conditions that lead to poverty.
David Starkey?
You ended, Michael, by asking the question, what do we do about the poor? Once upon a time, in this great cathedral, we would have revered them and sought to imitate them, because poverty, in the great bulk of the Christian tradition, is seen as an actual virtue in itself, and wealth as a vice. What's happened, of course, is a complete transformation in our moral values. It was a French prime minister of the last century who said, "Enrichissez-vous, get rich quick." And now everybody, conservative, socialist, and even Lib Dem, has gone down that route.
Michael Mansfield.
Well, may I just take up from the entrails, if I may put it, of what David Starkey has just said, because I was going to suggest that we have, over the last 2 decades, provided a new kind of culture, which is, I'm going to call it, take the money and run. And that, in my view, is an immorality. We have, from government's own figures, over those decades, 79 to 94, the poorest tenth in real income terms dropped by 13%. The richest tenth increased by 65%. And we have, on top of that recently, the National Audit Office claiming quite rightly that there have been millions purloined by individuals asset stripping public utilities. We have to create a different quality of life.
Projecting well this morning, Michael. Janet Daley?
Michael Mansfield's logic is as unsound as his figures, I'm afraid. Gordon Brown's budget does mark a real turning point in post-war British history, but not because, as he seems to think, it's very radical, but because it isn't radical at all. What it shows us is that Labour, and thus all the major political parties in Britain, now accept what has been the Conservative philosophy for the past 18 years, that the poor must be encouraged to take some responsibility for their own condition, that self-help and self-respect are to be encouraged for every citizen, that the poor are not necessarily permanent victims of an inherently unjust society. A moral society isn't something that can be engineered by the state. That route leads to totalitarianism, but must rely on every individual making choices in his own life.
Janet, panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is the Right Reverend David Jenkins, the former Bishop of Durham, of course. Bishop, do you make a distinction between the deserving poor and what, for lack of a better word, one might call the feckless?
No, I think not to begin with, especially when you've got all the questions you've raised and all the questions that have been raised around the table. I found a new way in onto this issue of poverty, because I've been mixed up with issues about how utility regulators and prepayment meters affect the poor. The people who haven't got the money so they feed in to the meters and therefore they can be cut off and all that sort of thing. And I have discovered that the poor don't like being described as the poor, and one of the things some of them say is we should be talked about as the low-waged or the no-waged. And I think this shows a way in that, like the issue of welfare, the issue of poverty is really about who do I think I am, who do I think my neighbours are, and what sort of society do we going to try and develop.
Janet Daley, your witness.
Those are very different questions. Who do I think I am? Who do I think my neighbours are? And what sort of society do I think
But they
should
are
develop?
all very closely connected, surely.
Perhaps. I don't know.
Very closely.
You yourself have been very closely connected with what you might call the economic and social advice that the Church has given to governments and so on. Don't you feel that the traditional role of the Church has been to advise individuals on how to make moral choices rather than to advise governments on economic policy?
I don't think that the role of the Church is confined to that, but I think that the Church is perfectly entitled to ask governments and everyone else questions along the lines that I was raising. Who do we think we are? How is it related to our neighbours? And how do we organise this? And seeing that we are now all caught up in what in one form or another is a globalised economy which everyone seems to put their trust in, one of the questions is, okay, and how does this help with the trickle down and so on? And that's why I think the no wage and the low wage is rather a good way in.
But you yourself made it clear that the poor dislike being described as a sort of homogeneous mass.
Absolutely.
They want to be seen as individuals. And wouldn't it be a unique role for the Church to take to help them to make choices as individuals rather than to feel as passive victims, as it were?
That would be a very good role. It doesn't seem to be a very good role to remind cabinet ministers and people who write for the Daily Telegraph that they also have a unique role in bringing these things about.
And a very different role
Yes.
from the Church.
Yes,
don't you think?
No, because the Church ought to be concerned with everybody. Also, it's made up of people who are just everybody, like anyone else. And so we've all got to challenge ourselves on precisely these issues. And I don't see why that anyone, including the Church, or indeed in one way, least of all the Church, should be confined.
Can I put it to you that when I, as a Daily Telegraph columnist, write about these issues, I get shoals of letters saying, why is the Church into social and economic policy? Why is it into advising government? Why isn't it relating to the individual and his own moral responsibility?
Because on the ground, that is precisely what the Church is doing. But once you get to the next level of what gets into the papers, you then have to raise, how do we all work together on these things?
David Starkey, your witness.
Bishop, I began, rather unusually for me, by trying to describe some aspects of the Christian tradition. I am right, am I not, that for most of the history of Christianity, poverty in this world was seen as a pathway to salvation in the next? As an overarching thing it was, but I think it's very important to distinguish between the poverty which was thought to be blessed, which people actually chose, and that was what monks and people were about, and what happened to ordinary people. So I think your generalization was correct, but it didn't apply at the next ground level, really. The Church, I think, has never thought, just because you are poor, it is a good thing. How you respond. Forgive me, it is also thought, has it not, that because you were rich, it was probably a bad thing. I mean, presumably, it's not an error in the translation when Jesus is supposed to have said that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
Is it an error in translation?
No, it's not an error in translation. And it's a splendid Hebrew metaphor and warning. And of course, I suppose it is more difficult if you're rich. That is why I suppose the Church was able to exploit the rich and get a lot of money out of them.
And build Durham Cathedral.
Yes, because they had guilty feelings. Yes, in other words, it isn't as simple as all that, is it? But the important point nowadays, I think, is precisely the point about whether you have a choice or not. Hence, no wage, low wage, how do I get into the system?
Bishop, so can we then just take this a little bit further? The problem with what you're saying, though, and indeed what things in Faith in the City seem to be saying, is that we want to try and make everybody sort of as rich as possible to make sure that they have the video recorders and the central heating, which is necessary for social participation. This is a very materialistic
Yes,
view
I
of a
suppose
community.
you could read that into it. I never supposed that. I thought that what we wanted was that everybody should treat it in some way equally seriously and been given a bit of a chance to make their own choices, and then you have to decide what you do with your choices.
So are you saying then that material goods and benefits are necessary for the good life?
Sufficiency is, especially now.
How do we define sufficiency?
You don't. You work it out as you go along, and you keep this sort of discussion going. And that is
Well,
what you
that
want
indeed
to
is how we
open
all
up.
make our money too, Bishop. But I think the more important thing is if you would try and explain to me what a sufficiency means.
A sufficiency means that if I have to make vital choices about the way in which my children live and how they're fed, then I should have some sufficiency, as it were, guaranteed to me out of respect to me as a citizen, which doesn't make me totally dependent on other people.
Bishop, you were here throughout a long period of the closure of the pits in the northeast and so on. We sort of talk perhaps dismissively of poverty being poverty with a video recorder and everything. Do you think true poverty in its historical sense still exists in this part of the world and elsewhere in Britain?
I'm afraid at the very sort of bottom and on the fringes it actually does. That is to say, there are people who are endlessly worried about how they will not only get over the burden of debt they've got into, but how they're going to get the next meal, and certainly how they'll keep their meters full so that they can keep warm and have water. I mean, I've literally discovered this on this last trip I've been on, really. So there is, and comparatively, of course, with everyone going up.
I'm thinking in absolutes,
yes, I don't think
rather
we can.
than comparatively.
No. Well, I think.
And is that an absolute when you're talking about people who are worried about whether they've got enough water and thing, or is that poor management of their own affairs?
No, it isn't entirely. You see, I think the evidence. I think it is damn closer to it than we're ready to admit. Though it's only a very small proportion.
Janet Daly, you wanted a quick comeback.
Yeah, I found your answer to David Starkey rather confusing. You said that everybody should have to make moral choices, but they should be guaranteed the circumstances in which they can make those choices.
I think
Who does the guarantees? It sounds like the way you treat a child. You kind of give them a context of safety, and then within that they can make choices.
We as a society have to help with the structuring of society so it does this, because we're all so totally interdependent. We haven't got a large number of peasants on small holdings who can make a difference to their standard of living by a bit of effort, and all the rest of it.
But who is to guarantee? Who is to provide the guarantees within which people can make these choices?
I believe the political system, pursuing questions like Mr. Blair is raising about welfare and Mr. Brown is tackling in the budget.
Isn't the problem that Janet Daley wants to individualize morality, whereas of course there is an individual responsibility, but there's also a corporate, a community responsibility, and it's a both and, not an either or.
Yes, I think this is very important. I think we're still too dominated by Karl Marx. We're over dialectic, and we either have to be individual or we have to be relational or collective, and we've got to be all three.
Bishop, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is John Elliot, who's director of County Durham Business Link, and the local development agency runs his own business as well. John Elliot, is poverty really the problem that people make out?
I think poverty, the description, the word poverty, conjures images of 16th century squalor. I think that's very dangerous. It's about relative wealth. And you can't have the rich without the poor. You can't have everyone equally rich. Different people have different requirements, different amounts of wealth, and different needs. Lots of people in society have low aspirations, and we shouldn't decry that. We should accept that, rather than try and make everyone into rocket scientists.
Are we dealing with poverty then in a sensible way?
I think the government interferes too much, and therefore need is a great motivator. And if people don't need more, they won't be motivated. So, and everyone, by and large, sets their own level. I believe everyone in the United Kingdom today could earn more money this week if they chose to. But they choose not to. They choose to not give up their free time. Or everyone could consume less, but they choose not to, and quite right too. We all could eat less. Certainly I could.
Sorry, what are you saying, that the poor are happy being poor, or a substantial portion of them are?
Everyone needs more money, don't they? Some people need an extra yacht in Marbella. Some people want a video recorder. What is the difference?
Michael Mansfield?
Well, what is the difference? Let me ask you the question. What is the difference between...
There is no difference.
You say there's no difference.
There's no difference between your requirement for a yacht in Marbella
He's already got one.
A second yacht in Marbella, and the next miner wanting a new video recorder. It's both to satisfy some desire.
Well, may I just say the differential that we're really concerned about in this day and age is perhaps not the differential between those two objects, but between some people living hand-to-mouth day to day and an increasing number of people having 3 yachts in Marbella. Now, do you recognize the polarization that is occurring?
No, I think it's absolutely the same. No one is risking survival. We can all... Convenience food, and the food that we all consume now, is more expensive than healthy food.
It certainly is.
Yet most people choose to buy biscuits.
They have no option. I suggest you're not living in the real world.
No.
People don't have moral choices in which they can decide they're going to buy organic food. Organic food costs 1/3 more. The average family...
Organic food is cheaper than convenience food. And most people buy convenience food. Look at the shops. Just go and look in the local supermarkets and see the people there buying biscuits and many things which are very... Why shouldn't they? Absolutely right to desire those things as well. And they can still manage to buy those things. There are very few people... I've never seen anyone yet starving in this country.
And how do you fulfill that obligation?
How do I personally...
We'll let him.
Yes. How do you fulfill the obligation?
How do I personally fulfill that obligation? Probably very badly. Or not well enough.
No, I want
How do you fulfill it?
Well, I'll tell redistribution of wealth is a start.
No, it will solve nothing.
I'm not suggesting anything is a panacea, nothing solves it, but you have to set a different agenda. Do you agree the agenda of the last decade has been make as much and get away with it?
Probably is, and that is wrong.
David Cook, you would.
I'm intrigued by this notion that everybody can go out and earn some more money. I'm thinking of the elderly, I'm thinking of the chronically sick, I'm thinking
I didn't say
of the
everyone, I
homeless.
said the vast majority.
Well, what are we going to do with the people who are not the vast majority?
Those people need to be helped.
And who's going to help them?
Well, it's better done through charities, through like the church.
There's no justice involved. It's just charity. It's whether or not people feel like giving rather than they deserve.
But people are charitable. People are naturally charitable.
Well, no, they're not. What we're finding is that we're having to blackmail people into charitable giving by offering them lottery tickets and a chance of winning a great deal of money.
Sorry, a point of information, that's wrong. People give to charity in this country at an unprecedented level, considering the national earnings. Oh, no. Compared to national earnings, proportion of national earnings.
Yeah. We're all driven by basic instincts, and one of them is greed. We all contain greed and envy. And I actually believe more people are concerned with making the rich poorer than making the poor better off.
But what about those who are not driven by greed, but are driven by
We're all
need?
driven by greed to a different extent.
Well, but
you can describe this need or satisfying some desire, but we're all driven by internal things, which are in our forebears,
But the
actually,
desire
which are
to have
essential
the
for survival.
basics in life.
Sorry?
The desire to have the basics in life. That's not greed,
But what are the
that's
basics
need.
in life? How much
Food, shelter, clothing.
Right. What do you think the lowest cost would be to survive on in food? What would it be? What do you estimate? To survive well, without being my weight.
No, leaving aside...
Michael Mansfield, what's the minimum amount that you could survive on?
He's put it plump too, yes.
It's obviously a relative question, and each person around the table will come up with a different figure.
Absolutely right. That's why you can't legislate for it.
Now, what
It's
I want
personal
to ask
choices.
you is, you've lighted upon greed. Do you feel that greed has to be addressed, or do we just accept it?
Both.
What you're saying, as I understand it, is that you have to accept it as a major
inevitable.
motivating factor.
It's inevitable. We can't do anything about
You
it.
can't do anything about it, so we leave a situation in which, as it were, you pass on the other side of the street.
Well, that's a very famous parable, isn't it? So let's...
No, hang on, David, before you launch into that, do you want to answer that, John?
Not really.
All right. David Starkey.
Well, let's actually try and get at an answer without hectoring, as Michael has been doing. If you actually...
No, David never does, yes.
If you actually, not on this occasion anyway, Michael, I'm being much more effective. If we actually look at why people now have video recorders and are still called poor, whereas when I was brought up, when I was brought up in a council house, so I'll get that one in, there was very, very real and genuine poverty. Why is it that poverty now includes a video recorder? Is it because of the sort of redistribution that Michael wants to see? Or is it because of the operations of greed through capitalism?
It's one of definition, isn't it? See, we all superimpose our own views on the situation.
No, it's a matter of economics, forgive me, it's not definition. Why do even the poor now have video recorders? Is it because of distribution?
Because they desire them, and they can afford them. Those two simple
But
things.
why are the video recorders available, and why are they able to fulfill those desires? It's because of capitalism, which is the product of greed, isn't it?
Well, I think greed's a product... Greed is within us, all of us, to a different extent.
And Adam
So
Smith
is
said-
charity. Adam Smith got it right 200 years ago, but we still haven't learned the lessons.
What
Unbelievable,
Adam
isn't it?
Smith said was that our private vices, like greed and vanity, are public virtues because they generate money.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far. I just think they're inevitable, and we can't do anything about it.
You're delighted with
David
the
Cook,
Adam
last question.
Smith model. Would you put the poor in the workhouse then?
Well, that's a very good one.
I'd like an answer to the very good one.
I think I've got to survive after this, you know. I think you've got to, people who work have got to have a benefit extra to people who don't work. Now, that may be unfair to some people, but if you don't have that, the system will be worse. So you've got to give people, need motivates people. And there are a lot of people in this society with low aspirations. Now, that isn't a problem. We shouldn't say that's a bad thing. It's a fact of life.
But they can't all fulfill the aspirations.
Some people shouldn't have them.
I suspect
that's
most
what
people
seems
do.
to be suggested.
No, I actually believe, by and large, people do fulfill their aspirations. But they always complain about it, because that's what we do.
John Elliot, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Bea Campbell, the author of Wigan Pier Revisited, Poverty and Politics, Goliath, writer in The Guardian. Well, you know where she's coming from. Bea, what did you make of what John Elliot was saying?
I didn't understand it. I understood his fury and his contempt. I didn't understand what
I think that's a
he
bit
was on
unfair,
about,
isn't it?
really.
Do you think poverty is a relative concept?
Of course it is.
Not an absolute concept.
Of course.
And can you really be poor if you've got a video recorder?
Right, let's get to this, the telly and video argument. This is such a...
Red herring is the word you're
Well, I hesitate to use the term. One of the things I think that characterises the contempt with which that kind of question gets put is that it disguises a fierce anger with people who might be living in a council estate, maybe living on income support, and dare to have a telly. 30, 40, 50 years ago, the same thing would have been said in terms of, and they dare to have furniture rather than living on orange boxes, and they dare to have cups rather than, having their tea out of jam jars. What's important, I think, about the possession of a telly and a video, and probably now a computer, is that this expresses, first of all, these may be high value added commodities, but however, they're very easy to get. What they also do is to connect people who may be immobilized by their poverty to the culture that the rest of us, who may not be pauperized, participate in. In other words, it expresses a commitment to living in the world, connecting with the culture that is our cultural universe. It expresses something very positive, and I think should be regarded with respect.
Janet Daley.
I think the words respect and contempt are absolutely central to this. I agree with you. And I found class contempt when I first arrived in this country 30 years ago extremely shocking, and I still find it shocking. But don't you think there's more than one way of expressing contempt? And one of the ways that you can express contempt is through a profoundly paternalistic attitude to lock people into patronizing assumptions about their inability to take any responsibility for their own lives. Couldn't social engineering be as much to do with the kind of social deprivation that I'm concerned about and that you're concerned about as anything else?
You'd need to say a bit more for me to understand what you're on about. Are you suggesting...
I get told off for saying more. That's
you see, there are all sorts of ways of coming at an answer. One of the things that's palpable about our economy is that government policy for the last 2 decades at least has produced the pauperization of large...
Right.
Hold on, if you want me to answer,
Yeah,
I'll
you
say a
wanted
little
me
bit
to say more, though. So
Well, I'm trying to engage with what I think you're on about.
No, well, I think we're talking at cross purposes then.
Okay.
Well, one of you spit it out.
Yeah, you finish your answer. Yeah.
Bea.
You finish your answer.
Well, this region would be an exemplar. Things that were once the sources of stable, respectable incomes, as a matter of government policy, have simply been annihilated. So there are villages and towns across the northeast coast who no longer have access to a legal living wage. Newcastle is a city that was built for the men on shipbuilding. We no longer make ships. Full stop. Right. So there are neighbourhoods in which people are paralysed. They can't move, their kids can't move, they don't want to leave the communities that sustain them, and yet they don't have access to a legal living wage. Now, if we're talking about social engineering, that's the first piece of social engineering that we need to address.
No, it isn't.
Oh.
I would say there's a much earlier piece of social engineering that we need to address that was about locking people, for example, into one-class ghettos, either through council estates themselves or through locking people into the
That's not a ghetto, it's
expectation
only
that they
place.
will. Oh no, I'm sorry, it is. I mean, when you come from a country where there is no such expectation, then it strikes you very much as a one-class ghetto. Passivity and defeatism are the things that have made it impossible for people to move out of doomed communities.
Janet, I don't recognise passivity and pessimism and this kind of inert...
I didn't say pessimism.
Well,
I said defeatism. And
Defeatism, I
passivity.
don't recognise
You
it.
don't?
No. What I
I'm
recognise,
surprised
however...
at
Now, let
that
her
bit.
finish, Janet, please.
Well,
Let her start, actually.
Let us start. I think one of the things which is underestimated in that version of events is how extraordinarily ingenious people who have no money are in terms of...
But
What?
I'm not
You're
talking
breathing
about,
what?
I'm not talking about being ingenious about how you spend
Well, that's
how
not
little money you
passive
have.
and-
I'm talking about, no. I'm talking about being inventive and innovative about how you move out of a doomed community. Don't you agree, can't you agree that the paternalistic social engineering post-war consensus of this country has helped to lock people in to their own sense of determinism, their own sense of failure?
Well, I have to say, I don't recognise the communities that you're describing, and I live amongst them. We're talking here, Janet, about a third of the population of Britain, a
No,
third
no,
of
we're
the
not.
population of your society. We're
not
talking
talking
about
about-
the people who we are. You're talking about them as if they were a them who, lived in these kind of
On the contrary, Bea,
swirling ghettos that
I
were-
suggest that you are talking about them as a them, as a homogeneous mass, rather than individuals like us who can move, who can be flexible, who could, in theory, move out of the doomed communities in which they find themselves.
But there have to be jobs. There
Now,
have to
wait
be
a minute,
opportunities.
David Starkey, your orders.
Bea, can we try and approach this from a very different direction? You began by singing the praises of computers and video recorders, and the sort of culture which depends on them. Now, what was it that created videos and television systems and computers? It's advanced, sophisticated capitalism, isn't it?
Go on.
Well, isn't it?
Well, what you on about?
Well, could I just have an answer like yes and no?
Well, human beings invented them, capitalism developed them, right? And what else?
And
what
made
you want
them-
to say is, well, capitalism is the source of all great wealth and wonderment, therefore, ragbags like me who are anti-capitalist, so to say, really are off the planet because we're not connecting with the great ingenuities of capitalism. Marxism, of course, was one of the first to recognise what a dynamic and ingenious system it was. Tell me what you're on about.
Well, it's very nice. No. A very good rant, and I will now tell you what I'm on about. Isn't it this capitalism also, which first of all closed the shipyards down, and
Yes.
secondly enables those shipyard workers to live the not bad lives that you describe because we've got so much surplus product? To use a little bit of Marxism for you.
I find this tone so offensive, I can't be bothered with it. What are you on about?
No, sorry, that's not an answer. Isn't it the
I don't
fact...
want to answer what a question
isn't
that
the
feels
fact-
like not a
right,
question.
Janet was right, Bea. Janet
Don't
was
get in a
describing
temper.
No, I'm not getting in a temper. Janet was trying that.
Well,
Janet,
you're being incoherent and rude, if I may say so.
I'm being neither, and if you'll stop interrupting, I will make the point. Janet was describing a situation in which an awful lot of people who do not work nevertheless can maintain reasonable standards of living because of state benefit. Now, the reason that they can
Pretty
be paid...
awful standards of
Well,
living.
but they can survive with their tape recorders and all the
True,
rest
they
of it.
don't starve.
Please,
And
Michael, just one second. And the reason they can do that is because we, as a society, are rich enough to pay them benefits in the way that the 19th century couldn't. Isn't that correct?
Yes, so what's your question?
I just want the answer which tells us
David,
we
can
can...
I stop you in mid-flow there, just to ask Bea a couple of questions that she might answer?
She might prefer to answer. It'll be easier. yes.
No. When John Elliot said that everybody, or he qualified it later, the sick and the old perhaps not, but a substantial proportion of the poor could go out and make an extra tenner if they wanted to, or could do without spending an extra tenner if they wanted to. Is that something you could recognise or agree with?
Indeed, one of the bizarre things about the conditions in which people live is that, of course, whenever they do make the effort to earn an extra tenner, given that they're living on incomes that are that are poverty incomes, of course they're blamed and accused of fraud. I think there's an extraordinary amount of ingenuity, not to mention stamina, amongst those of us who are poor, the third of us who are poor. However, what we're also kind of having to navigate our way around are very punitive social security systems that are very prohibitive. And indeed, I suppose what's important about Brown's exercise this week is that he's acknowledging something which we've not talked about a lot, but very important, that the poorest people in Britain are those with children or they are children. So we have to think our way around how on earth people can be enabled to engage in a public economy if they're the parents of small children who are the poorest people in the population.
And can I ask you the other overarching question I posed at the beginning of all this? Is equality of outcome as important as equality of opportunity?
Well,
is it important, in other words, to make the rich less rich as well as to make the poor less poor?
I would say yes, but I don't know that it's the relevant part of this conversation. I just want to address one thing which is kind of lurking around the argument about the virtues of capitalism. The great thing that perhaps David Starkey hasn't thought about capitalism is that it's an economic system that depends absolutely upon workers. If you don't have workers, you don't have a capitalist economic system. If you don't have their skill, imagination and resourcefulness, then you have a raggedy economy. That's what we've got, David. We've got a raggedy economy that produces people's pauperisation.
David Cook,
if you have a blank check and you can do something to make a difference, what would that be?
Well, I would start with an economic strategy that, first of all, invests in people, treats people, including people who are poor, as a resource rather than a problem, and that also recognises that the commodities that we associate with well-being and belonging to society are transformed with every generation. It may well be that the children of now, including the children who are poor, need a computer in the way that I needed a pen when I was a child, and to regard them with contempt because they might possess a computer, I think, would not be helpful.
Bea Campbell, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Sir Ron Norman, who's chairman of the Teesside Development Corporation. Sir Ron, who would you define as poor today?
Oh, I would define those people that haven't got a reasonable choice and reasonable opportunities in front of them. And
That's a very broad definition.
Well, yes, it is a broad definition. But
choose to do what? Opportunity to do what?
Well, let me start again. I mean, it does worry me that this whole erudite debate is about whether or not poverty exists, instead of accepting that poverty does exist because it's a relative state, and getting on with the debate of how we can tackle it and what we should be doing about it.
Okay, David Cook.
So how are we going to tackle it, and what are we going to do about it then?
Well, I think it's a long structural problem. I think one of the things that we've got to do about it is to make the people that are comfortably off recognise that there are people without opportunity and are in some state of poverty, and that those people ought to actually change their attitudes. And what we first of all need is a more caring society as a whole, which recognises that we're all part of the same society, and that those that are comfortably off haven't got to be forced to pay taxes in order to deal with the improvement in our community, but there is in fact a search where people are volunteering to find ways forward to help society as a whole.
But how do you produce that caring society? How do you help people care and take responsibility for others?
Well, I think first of all we've got to start getting people, and I think some of the people in this room and around this table need actually to get around into the real world just to see how a lot of other people do actually live. And once they actually do that, instead of reading statistics and reading the serious press, they would begin to recognise that
so
there is a problem. So what's
your development corporation actually going to do to help poverty then?
Well, my development corporation is going to close down in a fortnight's time, so we're not going to do a lot. Or a lot further. But I'm not here as a representative of the Development Corporation. The Development Corporation was a physical regeneration agency, which I think is an important part.
And did it work then?
It certainly worked as a physical regeneration agency, no question that it did that. But the problem of dealing with poverty is not only a question of physical regeneration, it's also a question of social regeneration. And that is a problem we have yet to address.
David, can I just interrupt your inquisition for a moment, just to ask you, you say we don't know how the poor in our society live, which presumably means that you do. Paint me a picture of what poverty means, if you can, very briefly.
Well, I once had an occasion to visit this. I was once a construction company manager, and I had a series of contract sites throughout the area. My job was to sit in the office and control the figures and make sure the money came in. And one of these sites was losing an unbelievable amount of money, and I couldn't believe that a site could lose this amount of money. So I visited the site to find that the loss was because of vandalism and damage and all sorts of mayhem. And I couldn't believe the extent of this loss. And I asked the foreman to leave me, and I walked around this area for a period of half an hour by myself. I walked in an area of housing where half of the houses were boarded up, the whole of the area was covered in graffiti, there was filth and refuse all over the place, and through this filth, and there wasn't a tree in sight, it was all house landscaping. A few people were walking, old ladies picking their way through with handbags and shopping bags. And I thought, if I was a father in this area, and I had a child of below average intelligence, and it's not socially irresponsible to have a child of below average intelligence, because 50% of our children, by definition, are below average intelligence. How would I give that child any hope, any prospects, and any standard by which I could bring him up to, or her up?
Would a start be by picking up some of the litter?
Well, who's going to pick it up?
Well, possibly your father setting a good example to his child.
Well, yes, of course it would, but I think we need slightly more than an example of that.
No, I just asked, would it be a start? Because you seem to be suggesting that it's society's job to come in and do something. And Janet began by asking the question about individual responsibility. I live at the back of a council estate. I am very struck there by the fact that there are two very different types of house. There are those that are cared for and attended, and there are those that are completely neglected with piles of rubbish outside, as you described. This would appear not to be a product of a state, but of an individual choice, wouldn't it?
But David, you interrupted me before I was able to get the point of that story across, and since it was a long story, I think I may as well get the point across.
And then you'll answer my question.
Well, then I'll turn to your question,
Thank
yes.
you.
But if you keep interrupting me, I'll lose my thread. What I said to myself was, how could I deal with that as a father if I was bringing up children in that area? And until you, David, can answer those questions, I don't think that we can rest. We clearly have a problem which must be addressed.
Right, my
talking
question
about picking up the litter is really trivialising the whole of that situation.
No, it's not. It's a start of taking...
No,
please, Sir Ron, it's a start of taking control of your own environment and not assuming that somebody else will do it for you. It used to be called self-help, Sir Ron, didn't it?
I'm not in the least opposed to self-help, and I think we should do everything that we can to encourage people to help themselves. But we have to go a lot further in terms of providing self-help in those communities.
Providing self-help, that's a contradiction in
other than
terms.
providing them with litter baskets and pick.
Thank you, David. Michael Mansfield, please.
I want to pick up on social regeneration and really dispose of the litter that has been strewn across by David Starkey, because it's the much smaller problem. What he doesn't recognize are the larger communities in which there is little hope. Now, how do you see the moral choices for social regeneration? Who begins the process? How do you see that development?
Well, society has got to begin the process. Society as a whole has got to recognise the problem more than it does. Political parties have actually got to be prepared to address the question, and churches and people of leadership have got to be prepared more determinedly to recognise the question.
But you need resources to do that. Well, to provide the social regeneration which I accept you're talking about, which I agree with. It requires, does it not, a national input. You can't leave it to the individual living behind David Starkey's estate or whatever it is.
Well, what I'm saying is that, first of all, we can't start the process unless there is a significant change in attitudes, and I really mean change in comfortable middle-class attitudes to this problem. And once those attitudes are changed, then the availability of resources does not become a problem.
And is the tax initiative one way of setting an agenda?
Well, I think, yes, a tax initiative, of course, is a way of setting an agenda.
Janet Daley.
You accused us implicitly of being out of touch with poverty and being naive about this. Forgive me, it sounds to me as if you're extremely naive. If your first association, if your first knowledge of this kind of council estate was by walking through it as a building entrepreneur, many of us, it may surprise you to hear, came from poverty at least as bad as that you're describing, know it intimately, and have some conception that it is possible for people to bring their own resources to bear on getting out of such poverty. Isn't it terribly patronizing of you to assume that government or society or the community in some institutional form has to spring people from the poverty in which they find themselves?
No, I don't think that's the case. And since we're all putting our own credentials on the table, I came from a very poor and deprived background. I only gave the example that I did because I was asked by the chairman to give an example, and my experience is not limited to that example. And I don't think it's at all patronising. It doesn't mean to say that I'm denying that there are benefits and requirements of society as a whole to encourage self-help and to encourage initiative. I think self-help and personal initiative are the great motivators of our society, and I'm not decrying those at all.
Sir Ron Norman, thanks very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. David Byrne, who's a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Durham. Can we, a bit late in the day, I suppose, start again trying to define terms? Is poverty more than just not having enough money, not having a job?
I think I'm beginning to not find the term poverty a particularly useful one. I mean, money always matters, but it's to do, there are a lot of people in our society who, first of all, don't have much money, and a lot of them are working as well, not dependent on state benefits. But they've also got insecurity of employment, of those people who come off an employment benefit and go to work. In a year, 50% of them are back unemployed. That kind of cycle of insecurity. They live 10 years less than the rest of us. They spend a larger proportion of the life that they do live, usually in relatively poor health at the end of it. And their children have little opportunity to move into other kinds of circumstances. So I'm beginning to prefer the continental European term socially excluded, partly because that's something done to them, not something they do themselves.
David Cook.
And who does that to them?
Well, the old argument, of course, about the poor was that the poor are poor because the rich are rich, yeah? I think we've seen a change in the form and style of our kind of capitalism. Capitalism is undeniably the most productive system the world's ever seen, but it's changed. It changed from a system characterized in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, while there was poverty, there was a commitment to a distribution of the things that capitalism could produce to most people most of the time, towards a very different kind of capitalism, which is becoming very divided and polarized.
We've had a lot of optimism that, well, let's leave it to charity. It's not a question of justice, it's charity. Are you optimistic there?
No, I'm not. I'm not particularly keen on the idea, by the way, that the solutions here lie in some them doing it, some powerful them doing it for the powerless them. But one of the things that's happened to the people I describe as socially excluded is that they've lost their power and capacity. For example, in this country, the traditional organizations which provided the power and capacity, trade unions for low-paid workers, have effectively been completely disempowered. You can't have an effective strike, official or not, in this country today.
So how are we going to empower people then, if that's the only route out of social exclusion?
One thing I would do immediately is to give to trade unions in this country the powers which are the continental European norm. For example, so that you cannot be dismissed in the course of an official dispute.
But that's fine for people who are in work. I'm thinking of people out of work.
Yeah, I think what's important in that respect is that I think we're actually moving back towards a full employment society, by the way, on the American model, but a full employment society based on a lot of low-waged and exploited people. That was certainly...
So you're making, hang on a second, you're making a comparison between, if you like, a continental European model and an American model, and what basically is the thrust and nexus of that comparison?
I think there are problems with the European model because it continues to have large-scale unemployment, but it gives people certain kinds of rights. In the American system, there are the individual rights but no collective rights.
David Starkey.
So you're really saying that we've got a choice as a future between looking across the Atlantic and imitating America or the continental European model of solidarity. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
But the choice may then also be a choice between a future which is very prosperous, the American model, in which capitalism grows, multiplies, creates jobs, and a European model which vegetates, which fossilizes and fails, and produces the 20% youth unemployment of Spain and France.
I think the model I would prefer to turn to is perhaps Christian democratic Germany, which has not been an unsuccessful economy in its historical past and continues to be relatively successful in a range of deals. But there are still, well, I mean, I think most people in this country would be very happy with the German standard of living, and the unemployed certainly would be happy with the standard of living.
But this is a luxury we don't
more
have.
of them
Janet, quickly, this is a luxury we do not have. We're in a viciously competitive international market, aren't we? You're saying because you prefer that sort of world, we should turn away, we should put up barriers around us, we should have a nice little cosy solidarity inside, aren't you?
I'm saying that politics has the capacity to manage economics.
Janet,
in the world of the internet and the world of globalization.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Janet, can we move this?
I would love an answer to that.
Yes,
David.
But I think you're wrong and foolish and shouldn't be teaching.
You mentioned that we were
Janet,
moving...
can we move this onto moral ground?
You mentioned that we were moving toward a full employment society after 18 years of this ruthless disempowering of trade unions. Do you see any connection?
Yes, I do. I think that there is a real problem because there is a notion that that some people express, I think it's wrong, that what we are developing is a situation in which we have a surplus population, like the surplus agricultural population of the early 19th century. And that in those circumstances, the only way in which those people can be brought into work is to bring them into work at wages which they regard as personally indecent and insulting. Yeah, exactly. We had the Chancellor's budget was a restoration of the old poor laws method of paying supplements to people's low wages. David Starkey's
but sorry, that wasn't my question.
But no, but I think
a good answer.
So a different question.
That is a solution, right? But it's a solution which actually neglects the developmental capacities of the kind of world system we have. Actually, I think capitalism is driven as much by curiosity as by greed.
So you're saying that people are happier, unemployed, and on benefits, and that is a better, that is a more sort of, that empowers them, as you put it, more than having a low-wage job with the ability to...
people are never happy on benefits. But they are never happy either being exploited. And what we are offering them is the choice between them.
Sorry.
May I just take you up on that? Because it's
Michael
very
Mansfield.
interesting how this whole discussion has been about models based on a Western society, whether it be, United States of America model or the German democratic model. Again, I think we're being...
the Soviet one, then?
Well, I haven't finished, Janet. Just
said
hang on a minute.
You
Just
never do,
hang on a
Michael.
minute.
You never
No,
Please get to the point of your question.
The point of the question is this. We are living in a very blinkered situation. 2/3 of the world are suffering in a situation which has been manufactured by Western capitalism. Now, what sort of moral responsibility do we have towards the other 2/3?
I think we have an enormous moral responsibility.
And how do we go about satisfying?
But I will say that I think that distinction between the 2/3 and the 1/3 is breaking down. One of the impacts of globalization, some people use the expression what they call the Brazilianization of advanced capitalism. That
And
our
what
sort
is
of
it
social
doing
order-
in Brazil? Precisely.
Absolutely, that it's producing...
You say we're improving the situation?
Well, what it does, among other things, is murder children in the street for being poor. Yeah.
Exactly. So the product of capitalism for 2/3 of the world is not some benefit of technology, is it?
No, I agree with you. But I mean, I think that there is a potential for development in particular ways. I actually am a great believer in socialism with a human face.
David Byrne, for a brief period there, you had everybody around this table nodding at you, and I knew it couldn't last. Thank you very much indeed.
Shaking their heads.
Yes, okay. So what do we make of all this, then, panel? What did you make of... Janet, did you agree with John Elliot that everybody could go out and earn another tenner or spend
Not necessarily,
less?
no. I don't think that's... I don't think that's the issue. I think it's really a question of whether you give the state the responsibility for, as somebody put it, I forget who, guaranteeing... I think it was the former Bishop of Durham said, guaranteeing the context in which people can make choices. That seems to me to be a truly pernicious idea. I'm sorry. The idea that, like a child, you can ring-fence, provide a safe context in which people can then act as if they're making choices. Either you have a free society or you don't. People have to be free to fail, to drop out. Social exclusion, I think, is the great sort of Blairite myth. These people aren't socially excluded, they are included in an extremely passive, defeated, depressed society from which they must be liberated if we're to make any progress on poverty, social poverty or economic poverty.
Michael Mansfield, Bea Campbell was talking about throwing the word contempt around. Did that strike a chord with you?
Yes, certainly being very contemptuous. Yes.
Well, I think she had every right to be very contemptuous. I really do feel that the debate is a much broader one. We're dealing now with forces which are global forces. And we are dealing with whole countries which are now insulated and isolated. We're dealing with whole communities that are insulated and isolated. Now, to talk about individual choices in those situations, whether it be in, South Yorkshire or the Northeast or in the Philippines, wherever the situation is, we now have to address this on a global scale. It is no use waiting to see if an individual picks up a bit of litter next door or whether they've got a video or a video camera. These are irrelevances.
So you hold individuals in contempt?
No, not at all. Quite the reverse. You have to provide, I think, a threshold from which individuals can rise up collectively with a certain amount of respect and dignity. You no doubt would see that as a kind of collectivism
Does the
which you
only
reject.
dignity come from collective action, then?
Yes, it does. I do believe collective action is the only way in which you're going to begin.
You're a
to
socialist with an influence.
And in fact, I dare say you would have been the first ones at the front of the countryside march the other week, because that's what that was claimed to be about.
David Cook?
I'm really saddened to hear this putting everything at the level of ideology and political system. Of course, that matters and that needs to be
I didn't
changed.
say
But there are real people who are hurting. There are real people who are suffering in poverty. And we need to help the elderly. We need to help the chronically sick. We need to help the long-term unemployed and make a difference to them.
Did that strike a chord with you, David?
Yes,
Starkey?
of course it did. And
You're not as heartless as you appear.
I'm not trying to be heartless. I'm simply saying that the reason that we can give to the poor, as was the case with the Good Samaritan, is because you are rich. And the reason why, on the whole, we give a great deal to the poor is because we're a rich society and getting richer. The interesting thing is people have made choices. Offered the choice of having more video recorders or whatever, or Coke or what, I mean, the drink, not the other thing, but that too occasionally, people all over the world have chosen to opt into capitalism and the fruits of capitalism. Our society also has answered Sir Ron's question. It did it at the last election. It decided it did not wish to increase taxation. It did not wish to have redistributive taxation. It has now got an ex-socialist government that says proudly it is committed to entrepreneurship, and it is also committed to workfare. We have actually won. We've been having a debate about absolutely nothing. The position that Janet and I have been espousing is the one that everybody who is serious now espouses. It's just that some of them don't like to pretend that they do.
Michael Mansfield, you're looking
I'm looking
baleful.
Yes, I mean, it's David.
Michael's out of it.
No, Michael's not out of it in this sense at all. I mean, David has done it again. Essentially, it is the selfish approach in all senses of... Yes, it is. It's talking about the self.
Self-love and social be the same.
Exactly. Self-love.
And social are the same.
No, they're not anymore. At all. Remotely the same. Because
David, please be
no,
Actually,
they're not.
No, one at a time, please. Michael.
I'm baleful because, in fact, David's approach to life is setting an agenda which I do believe has been the hallmark of the last 2 decades, and that is...
2.5 centuries.
Well, no. Well, it may be time for a change. It may be time for people to recognize that we have greater obligations than ourselves as individuals. We can be respected and dignified if, as you talked about, a caring society.
Janet, getting back to this absolutely basic question that I asked at the beginning of all this, should we be doing more to ensure equality of outcome as well as equality of opportunity?
No, not as a society. We shouldn't be trying to guarantee equality of outcome. That can only be achieved by a totalitarian society. If, in fact, we ended up with a more equal outcome, that would be fine. That might be morally desirable, but it cannot be state-dictated. And the idea that, of course, we have obligations as individuals, but we have them to other individuals or to groups of individuals, not to the state as some beneficent redistributor of all things that are good.
And do you make a distinction between the deserving poor and the less deserving poor?
If I was giving to private charity, I probably would, yes. But I think for the state to get into that sort of distinction is pernicious, and that's why the state is a poor source of such help.
I'm always very uneasy when David Starkey quotes the Bible at me. And when we hear about the Good Samaritan, what we have to remember is that 2/3 of the people passed by on the other side. It's not a matter of charity, it's a matter of justice.
David Starkey, I hesitate to give you the last word.
I don't need it.
Well, somebody needs it.
Michael, you're very good at doing it.
Okay. Panel, thanks very much indeed. That's it from this week. From our panel, Janet Daley, David Starkey, David Cook, Michael Mansfield, and from me. Until the same time next week, from Durham, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Buerk and produced by David Coomes.